Just give me one more chance to prove it, Mr. Grady. That's all I ask.
Stanley Kubrick is widely regarded as one of the greatest filmmakers in cinema history, and not without good reason. His resume is simply incredible. Paths of Glory, Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, 2001, A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut. For Kubrick, it was one powerhouse effort after another in a continuous string of masterpieces. And of course, one of Kubrick's most famous films is The Shining. This was a situation where Kubrick adapted a mediocre Stephen King ghost story and transformed it into a cinematic treasure. Indeed, The Shining is arguably the greatest motion picture during the long, rich history of the horror genre. No offense meant to Stephen King. He's a very gifted author. But in the case of this adaptation, Kubrick expertly expanded on the source material in a way that resulted in a truly profound viewing experience. And for the record, for the purposes of this analysis, we are focusing our attention on the 144-minute US theatrical release, although all of the main points are still applicable to the 119-minute international version. Over the years, I've heard many fans complain that the biggest fault with The Shining is that it didn't stay true to the source material, as if a master like Kubrick would allow his vision to be constrained because of a book. This was a pattern for Kubrick throughout his career. In the case of The Shining in particular, you can't stay true to Stephen King's source material if you don't have any ghosts in the movie. Yes, the fact that there aren't any ghosts is the key to understanding and fully appreciating The Shining. Nothing supernatural happens in the entire movie. Absolutely nothing. And that's part of the genius of the film. Believe it or not, it's spelled out right at the beginning during the interview.
For some people, solitude and isolation can of itself become a problem.
This is exactly what happens to Jack Torrance later in the movie. Everything in this interview is a blueprint for what happens to Jack later in the story. There was never any need for ghosts when Torrance succumbed to madness as a direct result of solitude and isolation. Furthermore, early in the movie, we learn exactly why someone like Jack Torrance would be susceptible to such madness.
The only thing that can get a bit trying up here during the winter is the tremendous sense of isolation.
And then he had an injury, so we kept him out for a while. And yeah, I guess that's about the time when I first noticed that he was talking to Tony.
I'm outlining a new writing project, and 5 months of peace is just what I want.
On this particular occasion, my husband just used too much strength and he injured Danny's arm.
So we know that Jack once injured Danny in a moment of anger, and it is strongly suggested that Jack had a drinking problem. We also learn that Jack is an aspiring writer, and he believes becoming the caretaker of the Overlook will provide him with the peace and quiet he needs to complete his writing project. Most importantly, we learn that Danny first started talking with his imaginary friend Tony shortly after he was injured by his father. All of these details are extremely important, and they all resurface later in the movie. Regarding Tony, it's important to remember that Tony isn't some powerful spiritual guide. No, Tony is nothing more than an imaginary friend who is an expression of Danny's innermost fears. We see evidence of this very early.
Do you really want to go and live in that hotel for the winter?
Sure I do. It'll be lots of fun.
Yeah, I guess so.
We can tell by his tone that Danny doesn't really want to go. This is reaffirmed by Danny's imaginary friend Tony.
I don't want to go there, Mrs. Torrance.
Well, how come you don't want to go?
I just don't.
We also know Danny doesn't have many friends. Such children tend to like safety and security. Danny never wanted to leave his home to go to the Overlook, and I suspect that has to do with him recognizing the vibe that Wendy herself didn't want to go. The power of suggestion. When Danny has his initial episode, the following interaction occurs between Danny and Tony.
Do you think Dad'll get the job? He already did. He's gonna phone Wendy up in a few minutes to tell her.
Jack phones Wendy moments later, confirming he did indeed get the job, just as Tony predicted. This would seem to suggest that Tony is more than just an imaginary friend. But when viewed from the perspective that Tony is the manifestation of Danny's innermost fears, what are we really left with? A 50-50 chance that he'd get the job, where Danny fears the worst and expresses a reluctance towards change. Even the good doctor suggests as much in her scene with Wendy.
Mrs. Torrance, most of the time these episodes with kids are never explained. They're brought on by emotional factors. They're more akin to auto-hypnosis, a kind of self-induced trance.
Before we dive in any deeper, I think it's important to introduce the concept of the unreliable narrative. The key to this idea can best be explained by examining this sequence. We see a model of the hedge maze. We see Jack looking down on it, and we're led to believe the next shot is a point of view shot of Jack looking down at the model. But in fact, this is actually an overhead view of the maze itself, with Danny and Wendy exploring it, after Wendy was previously warned that exploring the maze was quite the daunting task. Kubrick is telling the audience that you cannot always trust what you're seeing, and this is a key to understanding that there are no ghosts in Kubrick's movie. The biggest objections to the no ghost perspective include the following. Number 1, Danny has visions throughout the movie that predict future events. Number 2, Danny is able to communicate with Halloran through telepathic communication known as shining. Number 3, Danny has several encounters with the sisters, and Danny is abused by a ghost in room number 237. Number 4, Jack sees actual ghosts. Not only does he see them, he converses with them as they eventually try to convince him to murder his wife and son. Number 5, Danny telepathically calls out to Halloran for help, and Halloran heads straight to the Overlook to save him. Number 6, the ghost of Delbert Grady warns Jack about Danny calling Halloran for help, and Delbert also frees Jack from the storage room. And finally, number 7, Wendy herself sees evidence of ghosts at the end of the movie. These are the things most people point to when they claim there are ghosts in the movie, but each of them is a red herring, an idea Kubrick puts out there on the surface. But if you look underneath, it doesn't really add up. Nothing supernatural ever happens, and even the perceived supernatural occurrences have absolutely zero impact on anything in the story. These examples of ghosts being present can all be reduced to the unreliable narrative, where the audience receives unreliable visual cues that are intended to suggest unfounded conclusions. But there is never any proof that any of this is actually happening. Let us tackle these objections one by one. Objection number 1. Danny has visions throughout the movie that predict future events. Does he really? No. None of his visions amount to anything that has any tangible impact on the story or anything that can't be explained in a rational manner. He sees a vision of blood pouring from the elevator, and he sees flashes of the two sisters. But if you remember that Tony first appeared after Danny was abused by his father, it becomes very easy to accept these visions as the byproduct of the physical and emotional pain suffered by Danny. These visions aren't literal, as described by the doctor. They are manifestations of Danny's inner fears. He's afraid of change. The blood from the elevator symbolizes Danny fearing for his safety. Number 2, Danny is able to communicate with Halloran through telepathic communication known as shining. This never really happens. There is one line where we are led to believe this might be happening, and another instance of Halloran having some inside information because he has a supernatural gift. This happens when Halloran seems to telepathically ask Danny if he would like some ice cream. And the other example is when he calls him Doc. Wow, who could have guessed that a child might enjoy some ice cream? And the name Doc, well, as Halloran himself declares,
well, anyway, he looks like a doc, doesn't he? Yeah. What's up, Doc?
Okay, so Halloran called Danny Doc, and he also made a gigantic leap of faith that a young kid might like some ice cream. But what about all the things Halloran didn't get correct? Halloran may have guessed that Danny might like some ice cream, but he didn't know which flavor. He needed to ask him what flavor, and Danny informed him it was chocolate. He didn't know that Danny doesn't like lamb, and he didn't know that Danny's favorite food was French fries with ketchup. But when Halloran asks Danny how long he could shine, Danny stares at him like he's a nut job. Halloran doesn't know who Tony is, and he doesn't even know how Tony communicates with Danny. Halloran also proudly reveals,
My grandmother and I could hold conversations entirely without ever opening our mouths. She called it shining.
Yet we see absolutely no evidence of this happening. There is simply no evidence that Danny ever shines with Halloran. None whatsoever. Halloran claims to have been able to have entire silent conversations with his grandmother, but no such thing is happening here. Halloran probably believes he does have the power to shine, but Kubrick presents no proof to the viewer that this is the case. He may have been right about ice cream and Doc, but he didn't know which flavor. He was wrong about lamb. He didn't know about French fries with ketchup. He didn't know about Tony. He didn't know how Danny communicated with Tony. And he was never able to communicate with Danny without speaking to and questioning him directly. That makes Halloran's tally 2 out of 8 at best. 2 out of 9 if you consider the fact Halloran didn't know Danny was concerned about room number 237 until Danny himself brought it up. Resuming with the primary objections. Number 3, Danny has several encounters with the sisters, and Danny is abused by a ghost in room number 237. Does Danny actually ever see the sisters? Nope. Apparent visions of the sisters predate his arrival at the Overlook. Symbolically, like the blood pouring from the elevator, which is another recurring vision Danny seemingly sees, the sisters represent Danny's fears that something bad is going to happen to him at the Overlook. But the more important issue here is Danny getting abused by the ghost in room number 237. First, prior to entering the room, Danny can be seen playing with toys on the rug. A ball mysteriously rolls in his direction, and then Danny notices that the door to room number 237 has been open. There is a key in the door. Surely a ghost must have rolled this ball to Danny and abused him when he entered the room. But wait, look at this. When Danny first sees the ball roll into frame, the arrow in the rug is pointing behind him. The next 2 shots we see, it's pointing in front of him. This is a playback on the key from earlier pertaining to the unreliable narrative. It's not unlike this point of view shot where we are led to believe Jack is looking down at the model. What does this mean? I suspect it means that Danny himself found the key and opened the door. Danny was often seen wandering about on his wheels, where he freely explored most of the hotel landscape. Danny had a fascination with room number 237 for whatever reason, and it's never explained. He never had any visions pertaining to that room. The audience itself is told nothing about the room or the history, but we can assume that his curiosity got the best of him. The shooting of the scene clearly indicates that Kubrick is once again cryptically informing the audience about the unreliable narrative. In other words, we cannot trust what we are seeing here. But what we do know is that Jack is an abuser, and 2 days prior to the scene, there is a creepy sequence where it seems he might abuse Danny again. Danny asks his father if he would ever harm him or his mother. Jack becomes resentful and asks if his mother told him that. One important thing to understand is that Jack resents Wendy to the extreme. By the end of the discussion, Jack looks as if he's losing his temper as he tightly grabs Danny's left shoulder. This is the last time we see Danny with anyone. Then Wendy hears Jack yelling in agony. He reveals that he had the worst nightmare, a terrible dream where he killed Wendy and Danny and chopped them up into little pieces. Wendy tries comforting Jack, and that is when Danny first surfaces with his injury. It's his left shoulder and the left side of his neck that are injured, the exact area where Jack had his hands when we last saw them together. Wendy immediately blames Jack for hurting Danny, and Jack looks on dumbfounded. He never denies this. Jack instead still looks as if he's woken up from a horrible dream, and he has, because he's just come to the realization that he once again abused and injured his son after losing his temper. Something that was brought on when Danny fed into Jack's resentful attitude towards Wendy. The power of suggestion set Jack off. This directly ties in with objection number 4. Jack sees actual ghosts. Not only does he see them, he converses with them as they eventually try to convince him to murder his wife and son. Note that Jack never supposedly saw any ghosts prior to the moment when Wendy correctly accused him of hurting Danny. There was no evidence of Jack seeing any ghosts before this. After Wendy becomes aware that Jack hurt Danny, Jack heads to the gold room wishing he had a drink in a moment of self-reflection. This is when he first sees Lloyd. Jack thinks he has 2 20s and 2 10s in his pocket. He doesn't, but his credit is good. This is almost certainly an indication that in reality, Jack has bad credit. Jack then proceeds to bitch that he never laid a hand on Danny, before referring to him as a son of a bitch. He then begins calling Wendy a bitch, complaining that she will never let him forget what he did. Jack describes the injury he inflicted upon Danny, using the exact same type of language Wendy was using earlier when she was doing her best to make excuses for Jack's short temper that resulted in their son being harmed. By the end, Jack is cursing about what Danny did that caused him to injure him. There is no ghost here, however. This is all about Jack's inner struggle where he is reliving the experience because he quite literally just did the same thing again. He hurt Danny again. And after 5 months of sobriety, he wants a drink. The exact vice Wendy suggested was the real problem. Only this time, Jack wasn't drunk when he hurt Danny. Suddenly, Wendy busts in frantically. Note that Jack's entire encounter with Lloyd happened in the presence of a reflective surface, the mirror behind the bar.
There's a crazy woman in one of the rooms. She tried to strangle Danny.
Are you out of your fucking mind?
No.
Whoa! A crazy woman in one of the rooms? Was Danny abused by a ghost after all? No, he was not. What happened here is typical of the type of things that often happen in abusive relationships. Danny made up a story because he didn't like seeing his mother upset. Wendy, desperate to believe her husband would never harm their son again, she buys into the ridiculous story. Even Jack himself is amazed that Wendy would entertain such an absurd explanation for Danny's injury. But there is another interesting reveal in Jack's first encounter with Lloyd. Earlier, Wendy noted to the doctor that Jack hadn't had a drop of alcohol in 5 months, since he injured Danny. Jack repeats this point when he first sees Lloyd declaring that the drink he wants is his first in 5 months. But in that same conversation, Jack also says this.
It was 3 goddamn years ago. The little fucker had thrown all my papers all over the floor. All I tried to do was pull them up.
This strongly implies that there was more than one incident of past abuse, establishing a pattern of abuse. This acts as further confirmation that Jack was the one who injured Danny, not some mysterious crazy woman in room number 237. The next time Jack sees a vision is when he enters the bathroom of room number 237. He sees a beautiful woman emerge from the tub, and he kisses her. She then transforms into a gruesome old hag who begins aggressively taunting him. One must remember that Jack resents Wendy. The evidence of this can be seen throughout the movie. Specifically, it began in this moment.
It's just a matter of settling back into the habit of writing every day.
That's all it is.
Then we see Jack angered when Wendy intrudes on his workspace.
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Then we see the moment when Danny asks Jack if he'd ever hurt him or Wendy.
Did your mother ever say that to you? That I would hurt you?
No, Dad.
You sure?
Yes, Dad.
And there is more evidence of this afterwards.
I could really write my own ticket if I went back to Boulder now, couldn't I? Shoveling out driveways, working a car wash.
The language here reveals everything he always believed about Wendy. All of his resentful attitude explodes out here in this quick exchange, revealing his true feelings about Wendy and how she ruined his life.
I have let you fuck up my life so far, but I am not gonna let you fuck this up.
He blames Wendy for not living a better life. Jack never had any real skills. He thought he could be a writer if he had the time, and figured an easy job watching over the hotel would give him time to write. Jack seems to believe he deserves a better life, a better job, but he lacks actual talent, and he blames his family for his failures. Hence the past abuse when he got rough with Danny, and his overall resentful attitude towards Wendy. Jack can't write for shit. And looking back at this shot representing the unreliable narrative, it's somewhat ironic here that while Jack is lacking imagination with a bad case of writer's block, as Jack struggles being creative and innovative, Wendy and Danny resourcefully find the Maze Center through patience, trial and error, and persistence. The exact type of attributes Jack lacks with his failed writing efforts. When Danny lied to Wendy to cover for Jack, Danny planted the seed that there was a woman in the room. Jack again sees a reflective surface when he sees the beautiful woman. This again is Jack imagining a better life for himself, where instead of being married to Wendy, he is with a beautiful woman. But Jack is suddenly brought back to reality when he realizes the beautiful woman is actually a ragged old hag, which represents how he truly views his wife, a monster. There was nothing in room number 237, and Jack admits as much when he reports back to Wendy. Then Jack, realizing Wendy is now desperate to believe he didn't hurt Danny again, Jack flips the script.
Once you rule out his version of what happened, there is no other explanation, is there?
This is a very important quote that we will get back to. Jack returns to the Gold Room, and this time there's a big rockin' 1920 style party. This time Jack has money and he is much merrier, but his money is no good there. The fantasy of how awesome life without Wendy would be. He has the money, but is so well respected in this fantasy, he doesn't even need it. Jack again has a reflective surface before him. Jack looks ready to party, but the butler spills a drink on him. And that leads us to objection number 5. Danny telepathically calls out to Halloran for help, and Halloran heads straight to the Overlook to save him. Except this never happens. The closest we see for evidence supporting this is the shot here where it is unreliably suggested that Halloran and Danny are communicating about room number 237. But once again, the power of suggestion is at play. Halloran is chilling in Miami. There is no evidence he had any concern about Danny at any point before this, including the point when Jack injured him. The real reason Halloran became convinced something was wrong is when he watched the news weather report. That's it. Halloran simply ran with his imagination here. The weather forecast triggered an idea that something was terribly wrong, and he simply ran with it. This was amplified by the phones being out, the roads being closed, an overturned truck, and sheer paranoia.
Larry, just between you and me, we got a very serious problem with the people who are taking care of the place. They turned out to be completely unreliable assholes.
Objection number 6. The ghost of Delbert Grady warns Jack about Danny telepathically calling Halloran for help, and Delbert also frees Jack from the storage room. Once again, Jack's so-called conversation with a ghost happens in front of a reflective surface. But there are a lot of problems with this scene, where it quickly becomes obvious that there is no ghost. It's another moment of self-reflection.
What do they call you around here, Jeezy?
Grady, sir. Delbert Grady.
Miss Grady, weren't you once the caretaker here?
Why, no, sir.
My predecessor in this job hired a man named Charles Grady as the winter caretaker.
Delbert Grady.
That's right, sir.
Charles Grady.
Delbert Grady.
There was never any mention of Delbert Grady prior to this moment. The former caretaker was earlier identified as Charles Grady, not Delbert. But more concerning still, Charles Grady supposedly went into a fit of madness where he murdered his family in 1970. But Delbert Grady, Lloyd the bartender, and the slew of guests were all from the 1920s. They were never mentioned previously in the film, because what's really happening here is that Jack is having another moment of self-reflection, and this is where he totally surrenders to his madness. When thinking back on the horror story at the interview, Jack mistakenly got the name wrong in his little daydream fantasy, but he remembers the important detail about the axe murders. And through the power of suggestion, Jack has made the decision that life would be better if he eliminated Wendy and Danny, the two individuals he resents most for holding him back, which is a defensive mechanism for the fact Jack sucks as a writer and has no talent. What about Delbert specifically mentioning Halloran? I think that's easy to explain. By this point, Jack already knows that Wendy was looking for a way out. It's not unreasonable for him to think they sought help. And Jack was aware that Halloran took some kind of interest in Danny, so he jumps to that conclusion. It's also important to note that given the unreliable nature of the narration, it remains unclear if these scenes really happen as Kubrick presents them. Jack never acts on the information that Danny is telepathically communicating with Halloran. It isn't until Jack hears the radio. That's when he acts. It had nothing to do with any perceived warnings from Delbert Grady. It was because he heard the call coming in on the radio. And by that point, Wendy was on to him, so it served his interests to disable the radio and the snowcat at that time. Jack didn't do either of these things after he was supposedly warned by Grady. He did them when he heard the real-world physical stimulus like everyone. After Jack was clobbered silly by Wendy, he had been locked in the storage room. This is one of the biggest objections to the no-ghost interpretation. But this isn't a huge issue if you follow the real narrative beneath the surface of the unreliable narrative. When Jack is freed from the storage room, he yet again has a reflective surface before him. We hear the voice of Delbert Grady, but we cannot actually see him. During this conversation, Jack begs for another chance.
Just give me one more chance to prove it, Mr. Grady. That's all I ask.
The language used here is typical of an abuser pleading for another chance from the victim of his abuse. The answer here is obvious. Danny is the one who freed his father from the storage room. Because there are no ghosts here, and we know that Wendy didn't set him free. Danny is the one who set Jack free. And this is consistent with everything we know about Jack's pattern of abuse towards his son and his resentment towards his wife, as well as Danny's desire to keep the peace between Jack and Wendy.
Once you rule out his version of what happened, there is no other explanation, is there?
And finally, objection number 7. Wendy herself sees evidence of ghosts at the end of the movie. Except she doesn't. There are no ghosts here. By the time Wendy starts having hallucinations, she has been through a traumatic emotional roller coaster. First, she discovers her son was once again injured by Jack. Desperate to find a reason to deny Jack did this, she buys into Danny's made-up story about a crazy woman in room number 237. She then listens in disbelief when Jack suggests that Danny did it to himself, before Jack reveals his true feelings about how Wendy has ruined his life. She then stumbles upon the terrifying discovery that her nutjob husband hasn't gotten anything done all of this time he was supposedly writing. Then she is physically threatened by Jack and forced to violently defend herself. She locks Jack in the storage room. Jack again exhibits language typical of the con abusers lay on their victims after the fact. He makes a last plea. She exhibits strength in denying him, and then she discovers that Jack disabled the radio and the snowcat. After all of that, she has the absolutely horrific ordeal with Jack attacking with an axe, where she is once again saved by her innovation and resourcefulness. She sets Danny free and fends Jack off with a quick stab to the hand. Wendy is then relieved that she has gotten rid of Jack before she suddenly snaps out of it. She abruptly comes to the realization that if Jack isn't after her, he must be after Danny. This is when Wendy was overcome with madness, and not unlike Jack's descent into madness, there is evidence that the isolation was getting to Wendy too. The power of suggestion strikes when she heard about the big storm, discovered the phones weren't working, and she sounded awfully lonely when she used the radio. We never see Wendy on the phone, but it's implied that she must have used it when she was lonely. After all, remember, the first jump cut we see after the arrival of the Torrance family is 1 full month later. And at that point, the family still seemed normal and relatively unfazed by the isolation. Jack and Wendy even joked that they've both been staying up too late. What really set Jack off was when he perceived Wendy's encouragement as belittlement. So when Wendy has her ghostly visions, which include the real moment when she sees Halloran's dead body, she is effectively suffering a traumatic mental breakdown of the highest order. The horror she endured during that short stretch of time cannot be understated. The fact that Halloran was murdered almost immediately after he finally arrived after his long journey, if that doesn't dispel the myth that he had some magical telepathic powers, I'm not sure what does. Most individuals who claim to have any type of supernatural psychic powers tend to fall into two groups. They are either con artists or they're delusional. In the case of Halloran, I think it's clear he was delusional. Recall his piss-poor track record from earlier. And at the end of the day, his delusions accomplished nothing. On the contrary, they led him directly to his own demise. Back to Wendy's visions, it is mighty interesting that anytime her or Jack or Danny, anytime any one of them had any visions of so-called ghosts, they were each alone. There was never a shared experience where two characters encountered a ghost at the same time. And indeed, the only shared vision was between Danny and Wendy, the blood from the elevators. This, again, is not meant to be taken literally. Wendy is having the same symbolic vision Danny had at the beginning. Fear for Danny's safety. And at this point, in the midst of a fit of madness, Wendy is clearly concerned about Danny's well-being. There are no ghosts. If you don't believe me, think of this another way. In most ghost stories, indeed in the original book The Shining itself, the ghosts exist because of some prior horror that occurred in that location, like a man murdering his family with an axe. The ghosts are the spirits left behind. But in the movie version of The Shining, not one of the so-called ghosts that appears is mentioned anywhere in the story. The two Gradys are not the same. There is no murdered bartender or the mention of a woman dying in room number 237. There are no twins either.
He came up here with his wife and two little girls, I think about 8 and 10.
And who the hell knows what was going on with Wendy's vision of the couple performing fellatio? A visual taken from King's book that has no context or meaning here. Instead, we believe they're ghosts because Kubrick suggested the possibility and filmed in such a manner where it's difficult to separate the reality of what we're seeing from the fantasy of the characters. This power of suggestion is obvious when everything in the movie is telegraphed in advance, but then plays out with a different twist where you read more into it than what is actually presented. The whole idea of isolation leading to madness is right there in the first scene. Jack being physically abusive is in the second scene. That's exactly what happens to Jack, but it also plants the idea that there's something strange about the hotel, and when you finally see Delbert Grady, you're led to believe he's the dude that killed his family, despite that event happening in the 1920s and the murder was in 1970. In a similar manner, the picture of Jack at the end is the ultimate tease to the audience. What possible explanation is there for that? Even in the context of a ghost story. Jack isn't a ghost. The film makes no mention of reincarnation. Jack doesn't see himself anywhere, even when he's hanging right on the wall in a public area. Wendy didn't see it, and neither did Danny. Kubrick puts it up there clearly to confuse and disorient the viewer, to get them to interpret what they saw in a way that's incompatible with the overall framework of the story. What do ghosts have to do with reincarnation 60 years later? It only makes sense if you assume Kubrick is the unreliable director, showing you things that didn't happen, cutting between things that don't go together, even manipulating sets and spaces in ways that don't make sense. He even gives us one final clue. If you watch the credits to the end, you can hear an audience clap, get up, and walk out. What does that mean? We are watching a movie of other people watching a movie. It's the ultimate mind fuck, and it wouldn't be surprising coming from Kubrick, who never really made a movie like The Shining before or since. When you examine Kubrick's stellar body of work, every film he ever made makes a profound statement about humanity and the human experience. Lolita provides the viewer with a thorough investigation into obsession. 2001 explores the nature of intelligence and resourcefulness. A Clockwork Orange is a comprehensive examination about free will. Barry Lyndon is an epic take on how a person's life is the sum of its parts as we journey through time. Full Metal Jacket centers around the idea of the duality of man with regards to peace and violence. Eyes Wide Shut delves into the realm of sexual jealousy and human insecurity. All of these movies make a profound statement about the human experience. They all have elements that focus on the darker sides of humanity, and yet some would try to have you believe that The Shining is just a simple ghost story. Hogwash. Nonsense. 3 final points. 1. Kubrick was a master filmmaker working with a large budget. Therefore, you can assume that any inconsistencies, continuity errors, etc. were intentional, and it's fair to ask why he chose to introduce them. 2. Madness often manifests as the inability to separate reality from fantasy. Therefore, they are unable to perceive events in a coherent, logical manner. They are essentially irrational, meaning that they directly experience inconsistencies, continuity errors, etc. in their day-to-day lives and interpret them relative to their own unique mental state. 3. The book is not the movie. While it may be interesting to compare the two, you can assume that Kubrick included only what he wanted to and made his own unique vision, as he did with Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon. Looking at details from the books to interpret the movie is useless. To reiterate what I stated earlier, Stanley Kubrick expertly transformed a mediocre Stephen King ghost story into a cinematic masterpiece. In conclusion, if you eliminate the fact that this movie is based on a simple Stephen King book about ghosts, and you view Kubrick's movie for what it is, there are obviously no ghosts in Kubrick's film. In other words, if you eliminate Stephen King's version of events,
once you rule out his version of what happened, there is no other explanation. Is there?
Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed, and have a wonderful night.
Little pigs, let me come in.
We got got a very serious problem with the people who are taking care of the place. They turned out to be completely unreliable assholes.
I recommended that little cocksucker to those people, and he's made me look like a complete asshole.
Let me out of here and I'll forget the whole goddamn thing. It'll be just like nothing ever happened.
My grandmother and I could hold conversations entirely without ever opening our mouths. She called it shining.
For some people, solitude and isolation can of itself become a problem.
Here's Johnny.
I saw it on TV.
See? It's okay. You saw it on the television.
During the winter, he must have suffered some kind of a complete mental breakdown. He ran amok.
My husband had been drinking, and
Just give me one more chance to prove it, Mr. Grady. That's all I ask.
Yes, Dad.